Actually, it's an enormous pleasure for me to come to Sheffield. I really like the centre very, very much, very inspired by the centre. I like Sheffield as a city as well. I feel very comfortable in Sheffield. So I really enjoy my association with the Sangha here. And I love teaching the Dharma here. I've been doing talks on these Sangha Nights for quite a long time. And now I can't remember how many years, even before I actually formally became the president of the centre. And yes, these days I don't tend to script talks. I don't quite know what's happened to my mind, but I find it almost impossible to write things down these days. I have to just sort of, not exactly improvise, but just see what happens. And one of the ways, I know that you've got a series going on at the moment to do with encounters with reality. Encounters, I guess, with the truth. And Surimati very kindly, wrote out for me all the different talks that you've had. It sounds extremely rich. And I do want to address that theme. Well, maybe you can tell me whether I address the theme or not by the end of the talk. Let's just sort of see where we go. I want to start by just saying that here we are in the 21st century in Sheffield, in if you like, a modern Buddhist centre, part of a modern Buddhist movement that was, founded in 1967. But our background is very, very long. The Buddhist tradition goes way back, 2,500 years. And, in our own order and movement, we draw inspiration from the entire Buddhist tradition, doing our best to translate that into the contemporary context without in any way diluting the message of this great tradition. And Buddhism in its history has had its great efflorescences, it's waxed, it's waned. I want to start this talk by talking about the high noon, if you like, of Indian Buddhism. Not that long before it was sort of, began to be wiped out. I want to go back to 8th century northern India, to the great monastic university of Nalanda in northern India. I don't know if you went to Nalanda in your pilgrimage, Sheffield pilgrimage. There they are, they can tell you all about it. So Nalanda was this huge, it was a number of monasteries within this it was known as Nalanda Mahavihara. It was this huge place, a great centre not just of Buddhist learning but of cultural learning, a great university centre really, where people came from all over Asia to study. So it's full of monks studying, practicing, with, of course, the way that they no right livelihood in those days. It was all the patronage of the local kings and potentates and so on and so forth. And I want to go back to a particular period in the 8th century, we don't quite know when, and focus on a particular character, a particular monk within that monastery. And this particular monk, he'd gone forth, he'd left his homeland, probably in western India, in Gujarat state, what is now Gujarat state, probably Saurashtra, somewhere like that. And he went forth, went to Nalanda to train. And he was a bit of an oddball. He was in fact, he became the butt of the jokes of the monastic community, because he seemed to spend his time eating, sleeping, and going to the toilet. So he was nicknamed Busuku, which means eat, sleeps, poos. He was just the butt of the jokes of the monks, because they didn't see him doing any spiritual practice whatsoever. He didn't seem to study, he didn't seem to meditate, he didn't seem to do the devotional practice, the pujas, that sort of thing. He just seemed to, feed off the food that was supplied to the monastery by the laity. He seemed to spend his days sleeping and dozing and going to the toilet. Busuku. And this went on, and you can imagine in an environment like that, a lot of the monks in a monastery like this are highly intellectual, highly cultured, very, very serious people. And you can imagine also the sort of, very strong competitive kind of atmosphere. So to have somebody like this in your midst, in a way, it's quite good fun. Somebody, who can be the butt of your jokes, who you can sort of bully, ridicule, that kind of thing. These monks weren't necessarily that saintly, sorry to say. And the custom in this Nalanda Mahavihar, the custom was that every so often there would be a great teaching event where one of the monks would would sit on the Dharma throne, and he would teach, he would expound on a traditional Buddhist text or a commentary or a sutra or a sutra or a commentary on a sutra, or he would deliver an original teaching based on all that. And the monks decided that really this Busuku character really needed to be brought up against it. So they said, it's your turn now to do the teaching. It's your turn to sit on the Dharma throne. And of course, the teaching wasn't just to the monastic community. The patrons of the monastery were also invited, the kings, the potentates and so on, the wealthy merchants that were supplying everything. So the monks thought, this is going to be a real laugh. We'll have him on the throne. He won't know what to do with himself. He'll talk nonsense. We can kick him out of the monastery. So that's what they did. So the great day came, and Busuku was placed on the teaching throne, and he was asked, are you going to expound on a traditional text, or are you going to do something new? Is it going to be a new teaching? Is it going to be something fresh and new? And thought this was a bit of a joke, a bit funny, because I think they basically thought he was thick, stupid. And he said, it will be a new teaching. And they thought, well, this is going to be good. This is going to be fun. We'll be able to really ridicule him. And Busuku started to speak, and I'm going to read you just the beginning of what he spoke. Extremely beautiful, this. Oh, salutation to the Buddha. I bow down in adoration to the Buddhas and to their sons, and to the body of the perfect Dharma, and to all those who are praiseworthy. I will describe briefly, according to the scriptures, the way that the sons of the Buddhas enter the spiritual life. There is nothing really original here, and I have no skill in literary composition. I do not imagine that I can benefit others. I have done this to perfume my mind. While doing this, the surge of my inspiration to cultivate the good increases. If, later on, this work is seen by another person, someone like me, then they too might benefit. This favourable moment, so hard to find, has arrived. Once found, it should be directed to the goal of man's life. If this opportunity is not taken now, when will it come again? At night, in darkness thick with clouds, a flash of lightning gives a moment's bright vision. So, sometimes, by the grace of the Buddha, the mind of the world might for a moment turn to acts of good. The brightness is hard to obtain constantly, while the forces of evil are very terrible. What other good could threaten those forces except by that which is called the perfect bodhicitta, the perfect enlightened mind? This is the benefit discovered by the lords of the sages after meditating for many eons. This deep welling happiness overflows and uplifts immeasurable masses of beings. And it goes on. I won't read on. So this is the opening of the Bodhicaryavatara, the entry into the way of enlightenment, the entry into the life of a bodhisattva, the entry into the path of enlightenment lived for the benefit of all living beings, the path which isn't just to do with your own enlightenment, your own attainment, but which is concerned, as well as that, to bring deep welling happiness, as Basuku calls it, to all living beings whatsoever. So Basuku, whose actual proper name is Santi Deva, the god of peace, recited these verses and for many, many chapters, for many hours, and you can imagine the astonishment of the assembled community as these verse after beautiful verse in beautifully polished Sanskrit just poured out. Of course, they're stunned. How is this possible? This man that eats and sleeps and goes to the toilet, how is he doing this? What's happening? Even more astonishing, as he spoke, he started to lift off. He started to just float up into space. In fact, by the end of this great recitation, he disappeared, and there's just a voice sounding out of the blue space, and Santi Deva disappears from Nalanda Mahavihara and turns up in later Buddhist legend and story in the tribal areas of India, teaching the Dharma, teaching Buddhism to people who are really alienated from, that way of life, really down there with the people, really living the Bodhisattva life. And I'm starting with this, it's partly because the other week I was talking about this very same story in London, and it's haunting me, I suppose. But also I think it is already an encounter with reality. This very story is an encounter with reality. We think we know people. We think we know what they're like. Those monks thought they knew who this character was. He eats, sleeps, and goes to the toilet. But of course, they didn't know him at all. They just saw this outward appearance. What they didn't realise, that Santi Deva his practice was happening at night, was happening in the darkness of night, in the privacy of his monastic cell. You have to remember that these old Indian monasteries were extremely busy places, very, very busy, very noisy, very, very distracting. You even get Buddhist texts that talk about the 18 faults of a monastery, because they interfere, strangely enough, in getting down to spiritual practice. Really good monasteries don't, but some of these places do. In other words, they become a little bit institutionalised. So Santi Deva's practice was happening at night in his cell. Even more extraordinary, the tradition says, he had a personal teacher, because it seemed he had no teacher within the monastery. Nobody wanted to touch him because he was, such an unpromising specimen. His teacher was, how can I describe this to, those of you who don't have a sort of background in Buddhism. But anyway, his teacher was an enlightened being, a sort of, if you like, an archetype, a transcendental archetype of enlightenment. Nothing less than the Buddha, the Bodhisattva of wisdom. This is a figure named Manjughosha, the sweet-voiced, or Manjushri, the soft radiance, or the sweet radiance, or Manjunata, the gentle protector. A very, very important figure in Indian, Tibetan, Chinese, Japanese Buddhism. And typically, Manjughosha is a very, very rich, deep sort of amber colour. It's traditionally said to have the colour of a lion's eye, or like clear honey held up to the sun. This lovely, warm, golden colour. And he's holding the sword of wisdom that cuts through all of the darkness between you and the veils between you and the way things are. And he holds the book of the perfection of wisdom. And he's a beautiful youth. He's known as Kumara Bhuta, the eternal youth, the youth that has transcended birth and death. This was Santi Deva's teacher, this Bodhisattva of wisdom. It's very interesting, again, in relation to this topic of reality. It's very interesting to reflect on this. We think a figure to do with wisdom, which of course is very much to do with reality, of seeing things as they are. We think, perhaps in our Western tradition, it should be a very old man, like an old wizard wearing grey or something like that. In the Indian tradition, it's this eternal youth. Wisdom, reality is ever fresh, ever fresh. It's always bright, always renewing itself, always creative, always communicating. And the fact that you've got this, that wisdom is sort of personified, is very interesting. Not personified in the sense of, how can we make up a form to see wisdom? It's much more that wisdom is experienced in this way by these people, by Santi Deva. It's wisdom is, your reality expresses itself in that way. Very interesting way of looking at it. It's something that I think a lot of Western Buddhists find hard to relate to. They think that, Buddhism is very abstract. They hear about nirvana and enlightenment and shunyata, and it's all these abstract concepts. But enlightenment bodies itself forth. It takes form. If it doesn't take form, it won't touch us. It'll just be an idea. Reality won't get through. You know very well that if you're studying something, if you're looking into something, whether it's Buddhism or literature or whatever it might be, it lives when you're actually talking with somebody about it. When you're with a person who is living it and who understands it. If you're just reading it off a page, it often doesn't do very much for you unless you've got a very vivid imagination. Anyway, Santi Deva was receiving these direct teachings from Manjughosha, and his whole text on the Bodhicaryavatara, the entry into the way of enlightenment for the benefit of all beings, comes from, as it were, this divine inspiration. Don't take that word divine too literally. And, really, right from the off, Santi Deva is addressing this whole business of an encounter with reality. It's very interesting, his whole approach to the text. For a start, he insists that there's nothing original in his presentation. Actually, it's a highly original work, but he insists it isn't. And this is very interesting. Again, we're obsessed with novelty. In the modern world, in the West especially, well, everywhere, we're obsessed with novelty. Not with the new, in the deepest sense, not with the original, but with, the latest thing that can, give us a bit of a buzz or something like that. Santi Deva comes out of a tradition where if you're going to have an encounter with reality, you need to be aware of what you've received. You need to be aware of what you've been given. You need to be aware of the conditions that have created you. This is a very, very strong theme in his text. There's an enormous emphasis on gratitude, enormous emphasis on the wonder of a spiritual experience opening up to him, an encounter with reality opening up to him. And, if the way things are in Buddhism is typically described as conditioned co-production, that is, everything arises in dependence upon conditions, we are ourselves in this moment nothing other than a nexus of conditions interacting with each other which are giving rise, to further conditions. If that's the nature of things, one of the ways to wisdom, one of the ways to reality in Buddhism is the experience of gratitude. The experience of gratitude. Gratitude in Sanskrit is kritagnyana, which means knowledge. Jnana means knowledge. Krita means benefit. Knowledge of what you've received. knowledge of what you've been given that has really benefited you, knowledge of the people who have given it to you, knowledge of the whole, set of conditions, the whole lineage, if you like, of conditions that have brought this to us. So Santi Deva is very, very aware of that. He's supremely aware of that. So again, if we're going to be serious about looking at this whole question of reality and how we encounter it, one of the ways that we can approach this is to reflect on what we've been given. Not, I should say, to make us feel, sometimes do you remember when you were a kid, you're sort of told to feel grateful, and, when your auntie gave you a 10 bob note. Does that show my age? I think it does. A 10 shilling note. Do some people remember what that was? The aunties smelling of face powder, there you are, dear, go and buy yourself an ice cream. And you're told to feel grateful, and of course you do feel sort of grateful. But that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about an awareness of what's brought you here, an awareness of what's brought you to this place, of what's brought you to this precious human existence and to all the possibilities that are open to you. Again, I think there's something about our world sometimes which makes the experience of gratitude really, really difficult. Because there's so much emphasis on consumer choice, consumer rights, all those sorts of things. And sometimes there's just no encouragement, to really acknowledge what you've received, what you're standing on in order to practice. And I mean really ordinary things like a relatively secure and civil society, for example. That gives us enormous freedom, actually, in order to live a decent human life. So reflecting on the conditions that have brought us here, reflecting on the way we've benefited is a way of approaching reality, of seeing into the nature of things. But he goes a bit further, very, very beautifully. He says, this favourable moment, so hard to find, has arrived. Once found, it should be directed to the goal of man's life. If this opportunity is not taken now, when will it come again? Really love this verse. Often, bring it to mind in meditation and reflect on it. This favourable moment, so hard to find. The word for moment in Sanskrit is kshana. Kshana. Kshana is a very interesting word because it means this moment. So it's this favourable moment right now. It's quite an interesting way of looking at it. This favourable moment is this moment. It's arrived. Whatever moment you are in is the favourable moment. Because it's only from this moment, from this time and place, that we can actually make some sort of progress in Dharma life. So we really need to wake up to the moment, to the time that we're in, the immediate moment. So often we can be anticipating the future, brooding over the past, fantasising about this, that or other. We're not on the edge of the moment. We're not in our time and in our place. And while we're not in our time or place, we can't grow, we can't develop, we can't actually have the encounter with reality. If you're going to have the encounter with reality, you have to be fully present. You have to be in your time. You have to be in your moment. You have to know what's actually going on with you. You have to be fully aware and present to yourself and present to the environment that you're in and the other people that are in it. You've got to wake up undistractedly into the moment. So kshana means that. But he also means by this, the moment is this life. He means by the moment this life, this precious human existence is regarded as a moment. Very interesting way of talking. You know that thing, sometimes time can drag, perhaps especially listening to one of my very long talks. You want to do something else. But time can seem, it can seem to be going on. But, of course, when we get to the end of our life, or certain stages in life, we think, hang on, that was too quick. It was just a moment. What happened? You ever have those feelings, where you those moments where you suddenly can't work out where it's all gone, where time has gone, where your life has gone. So this human life itself is seen as a moment. And of course, Santi Deva's context is rebirth. He's got the whole context of hundreds, thousands, endless lives beforehand. He's got the context of this moment, of this precious human existence. When will it come again? When will we have this precious human existence again? So there's this sense of impermanence. We're not given this human life for very long. So if we're talking about encountering reality, one of the things we need to do is wake up to this very, very precious human life that we have. And it really is precious. I mean, there can be, discourses, narratives in the modern world which sort of say how terrible human beings are. We've done this to the planet, we've done that to the planet, etc., etc. And of course, there is that way of talking. But that can really miss the really incredible gift of being a human being. And probably because we don't recognise, or people don't recognise, the incredible gift of a human being, that is why so much damage is done. Because we don't wake up to the preciousness of human existence. It's not waking up to it in order to have power over other species or anything like that. It's waking up to our particular kind of quality. There's a very, very special quality to being a human being. Very, very special quality. We've got a very particular quality of consciousness. It's a consciousness that isn't just embedded in sense experience and having that direct sense response. Because of our minds, because of the way our consciousness works, we have the ability to reflect upon our experience, which means that we don't have to just react instinctually to what's going on, which means that we can practice ethics, which means that we can actually start to put a gap between our instinctive response and how we want to, put a gap between our instinctive response and behaving in a rather different way. So that if, for example, we don't like the look of somebody or somebody speaks roughly to us, we don't immediately attack them. We put a gap in. We find a way of working creatively, with that person, for example. This is absolutely the basis of Buddhist practice, because we have this special quality of consciousness. You can expand it. You can also, this quality of consciousness can sort of, as it were, very, very positively leap forward, as it were, and imagine the enlightened state, what Santi Deva calls here the bodhicitta, the enlightened consciousness, the consciousness of wisdom and compassion perfectly blended. It can imagine that, can see that, maybe in the form of Manjushri or the Buddha, or just as an intuition, just a kind of knowledge, an intuitive knowledge of the state of enlightenment. This quality in Buddhism is called Shraddha, usually translated as faith, but it really means a leaping over and a placing the heart upon the goal of man's life, or of a human being's life, as Santi Deva calls it. So he's talking about waking up to our present human condition and then directing that to its real purpose. So there's a kind of challenge, I think, to this. For Santi Deva, his real purpose is to live, to develop, to give rise to more fully to this bodhicitta, this mind of wisdom and compassion. But I think, whether or not one wants to be a Buddhist or wants to live that life, surely it's really, really important for every individual human to ask themselves, what am I actually doing with this life? What is my overall purpose? Because if we don't, we are going to squander our talents, abilities, our qualities. I was talking to somebody yesterday who was talking about the dilemmas he has between, particular ways of acting, and what criteria do you use to make decisions about what you put your energy into. And I could sort of see the genuine dilemma that was there. But I said, also you've got to be a bit careful, because I do, and I know people, I know Buddhists even, who they dilly-dallied so long that they, as our teacher Sangha Night said, they've got a great future behind them. You know what I mean? And we have to be really careful with that. That we really decide what we're really doing with this life, rather than fantasizing about what we might do, what we could do. We've really got to decide what our goal is, what our purpose is. So we make the most of this present human life and really develop it to the full. And then there's this beautiful image at night, in darkness, thick with clouds. A flash of lightning gives a moment's bright vision. So sometimes, by the grace of the Buddha, the mind of the world might for a moment turn to acts of good. So, I think this, I've never come across this verse in any other Buddhist text. So I sort of feel it has there's a kind of originality to it. I think Santi Deva is really talking from experience of a life which was like being in a dark night, covered over with very, very thick black clouds. We don't know really many details of his life, but really covered over. And then there's a moment, like a lightning flash, where reality is seen. Reality is seen. From the tradition he comes from, as far as he's concerned, that amazing moment where you see clearly where to go, you see what the path is. Your heart opens up to that. As far as he's concerned, that comes from two sources. That must come from the blessing power of the Buddha. It's very strange for us to, relate to that. But for somebody like Santi Deva, he feels it must come from, if you like, forces of good that are out there. But it also must come from his own acts of good that he's done in the past. There's a kind of meeting of his own good, meeting with the forces that are out there. But it's a lightning flash, a moment when something opens up. But he says the brightness is hard to obtain constantly. The brightness is hard to obtain constantly. And you see this. You see people, they have a flash. Something really opens up to them. They start to really investigate their life, really change their life. But then they forget it. The darkness comes back. They lose that sense of purpose. That sense of wonder even. It's like life, just takes over again. This is what can happen to people. I think, is it William James? Varieties of religious experience. I think he says something like, many people have sort of, deeper visions of life, sort of spiritual visions. Many people. It's very common. Very few people place those visions at the centre of their life and really live from them in everything that they do. So, if something's opened up for you, if you've had that lightning flash in whatever form it might take, it might not be some, mind-blowing vision. It might just be a deeper thinking about things. Take it seriously. Take it seriously. Live from it. Try to make the brightness shine, continuously, in your life. And he goes further. In the next verse, he says, yes, the brightness is hard to obtain constantly, while the forces of evil are very terrible. What other good could threaten those forces except by that which is called the perfect bodhicitta, the perfect mind of enlightenment? What Santi Deva is getting at here is that people in this world, people do good things. Lots of people do good things. They live from good things. We see this around them. There is actually a lot of goodness in this world. But one of the things that we notice as well is how easily those things get crushed, how easily those things get destroyed. You know, you can sort of look out sometimes, you know, if you listen to the news, or in your workplace, or wherever it may be, you can see that kind of almost battle going on between the good in people, just ordinary, straightforward goodness, encountering cynicism and heaviness, the forces of the marketplace, economics, and the world situation that we see at the moment is extremely perilous, where we see really good, ordinary good things being overwhelmed by very, very nasty forces. This is how it has always been. This is actually how it will always be. That is the nature of what we call the samsara. But Santi Deva is invoking something else. He says there is another kind of good. There is another kind of good, and it's called the enlightened mind. It's called the force of wisdom and compassion, which is actually possible for us to generate. It's possible for us to generate within ourselves, within a community, a kind of good that will not be turned back, that can't be broken, which is diamond hard, which is, he says in another place later on in the text, like a great blazing fire that can destroy the cosmos. In Indian cosmology, you have these sort of cycles where the cosmos goes up into flames. Well, he's saying this force of good is like that. It can consume whatever badness, evil, destructiveness that comes to it. I know this sounds like science fiction, but this is Santi Deva's vision of things. There's this very, very strong optimism, this very, very strong faith in generating this kind of mind, in generating this kind of consciousness. You've got to do a lot of spiritual practice to develop it. And it's not even to do with whether or not you're sort of successful in the world's terms. This is really interesting as well. It could be that you are defeated in the world's terms. You might well be defeated by you're doing your good things. It might be that other people defeat you, but you are not defeated internally. That enlightened mind is that diamond hard. But how do we develop it? How do we do it? How do we have that encounter with reality so that brightness goes on constantly? It's very interesting. Santi Deva's language about this bodhicitta is quite elusive, the lightning flash. And a bit later on, he uses another image. He says, this bodhicitta, this mind of wisdom and compassion, this force of wisdom and compassion, is like the alchemist's quicksilver elixir, which, if you've ever seen mercury, it just rolls along. So it's that elusive. But he says, you've got to get hold of it and work it into your consciousness, work it into your being so that you transform this ordinary human form into something like a Buddha. And the rest of his exposition on the Bodhicaryavatara is how you practically do that. What do you do to do that? How do you bring that brightness? How do you make that brightness shine constantly in everything you do? It's not, it's not one thing. It's not one technique. But I am going to mention something, and then I'll close. I want to mention the way Santi Deva talks about meditation. Meditation is sometimes described as being like a kind of alchemy. You're transforming the sort of baseness of your consciousness into this priceless jewel or into gold, something that can't be tainted in any way through your practice. His discussion of meditation is really interesting. And again, I think really rather unique, because what he talks particularly about is meditating on love, developing a mind of love and compassion. And it is a kind of alchemy, because he uses the whole, he uses that, the fact that of, in a sense, our selfishness to sort of undo itself. very, very interesting meditation that he gives. It's a sort of metabhavna, but it's couched in very particular terms. He says, in effect, that we are extremely important to ourselves. We're very, very important to ourselves. We really cherish ourselves. I know, some people have real problems with self-esteem and, all that kind of thing. But actually, we really do care about ourselves very, very deeply. We clothe ourselves, we feed ourselves, we house ourselves. We want to feel safe. We want to feel protected. We want to avoid suffering. We wish to be happy. This is what we do. This is what we do as human beings. Fine, well and good. Santi Deva says, yes, identify with that. Really recognise that you do that. And then see that actually every single living being is exactly the same as you. There really is no difference between you and all others in that respect. Every single living being wants to avoid suffering, wants to be happy, wants to feel safe, wants to feel protected. So why not identify yourself with the whole of life? He uses a very almost bizarre image. He says we've got this, all these limbs of our body, and if one part of our limb, one part of our body, a limb on our body hurts, we go to protect it. So he said, why not, instead of thinking like that, why not see every single living being as the limbs of a vast being? So that if, see, a Buddha over there is hurting, I feel it as my own. And I want to go and alleviate it in her, and so on. So he uses this as a meditation practice, as a reflection, but also as an imagining. He even goes even further and asks you to, as it were, go right out of yourself and fully identify with another. It even gets a bit sort of perverse, because especially people that you really don't like and don't like you, your worst possible enemy, maybe in your workplace or something like that. Identify with them. Feel exactly as they feel. Look back at yourself. See yourself through their eyes. And in that way, he says, you'll develop a great love and a great compassion, even for these very, very difficult people. He's so confident in this meditation practice. He believes that if you live like this, if you identify with all others, you will live selflessly. If you were meditating on this daily, doing this kind of meditation, you would live genuinely selflessly. You wouldn't even be thinking, in your activity of, oh, aren't I a good person? Aren't I a great bodhisattva helping living beings? You wouldn't think like that. You wouldn't feel elated if things go well. You wouldn't feel despair if things go wrong, because you're so identified with the well-being of others, and you regard them, as it were, as an extension in a very positive sense of yourself. They are, you feel them as if they are, as if they are you. That's the kind of meditation that he's talking about. And it's interesting, within the Buddhist tradition, this is regarded as a really important meditation practice. Among Tibetan Buddhists, and Lama can probably tell us about this is taken really, really seriously. I remember the Dalai Lama once saying, when he was asked, about what he thought of Chairman Mao, he said, Chairman Mao is my greatest friend. He is my greatest teacher. And the Dalai Lama knew very well the suffering that Chairman Mao had meted out on his people. But he's my greatest teacher because he is really teaching me how to practice love and compassion, how to practice patience, how to love someone like that. And he really meant it. And I've met, Tibetan Buddhist Dada Rinpoche, Sangha Night teacher, who really live like this, live in this way. Well, we can live like this. It's not just people from other Buddhist cultures. We can live like this radical commitment to, to this kind of loving kindness in everything we do, in relation to everybody, and living a life which is really giving ourselves, sharing ourselves as fully as possible. So I'm going to conclude now. I want to end with Santi Deva. I hope this talk has addressed the area of encounters with reality in some way or other. I mentioned that Santi Deva's teacher was Manjughosha, this Bodhisattva of wisdom, and the very last verses of the Bodhicaryavatara are extremely beautiful, and they're really about his relationship with, call it that, with this Bodhisattva of wisdom, Manjughosha, Manjushri, Manjunata. So I'll end with these beautiful words. Through being embraced by Manjughosha, may I always find the spiritual community. May I recollect my former births until I reach the stage of great joy. May I remain full of strength in whatever I do. In all my lives may I attain the perfume of discriminating wisdom. When I desire to see anything or ask anything, may I see and hear without obstruction the protector Manjunata himself. May my own conduct emulate the conduct of Manjushri, who works to achieve the welfare of all living beings throughout the 10 directions of space. As long as the existence of space, and as long as the existence of time, that long may my life be devoted to the world's sorrows. I take in the sufferings of the world, and may the world find happiness through all the pure deeds of the Bodhisattvas. Only medicine for this suffering world, the mine of all success and happiness. May the teaching of the Buddha, with all honour and glory, endure till the end of time. I bow down to Manjughosha, through whose inspiration my mind turns to the good. I honour the spiritual friend, through whose inspiration the good grows strong.